This is Kevin Donahue, Senior Director with Protiviti, welcoming you to a new installment of Powerful Insights. Today I'm joined by two Protiviti experts, and we're going to be talking about vendor management, specifically within the financial services industry. I'm happy to be joined by Brian Kostick and Chris Monk. Brian is an Associate Director with our Risk and Compliance Solution and a member of the Regulatory Compliance team. Brian, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Kevin.
And I'm also joined by Chris Monk, a Managing Director with Protiviti's Business Performance Improvement Practice and a leader with our Supply Chain Practice. Chris, it's great to speak with you as well.
Pleasure to be here, Kevin.
So, Brian, let me toss the first question to you. Give our audience a brief overview of third-party risk management and how it fits into the picture for financial services companies.
Yeah, glad to do so, Kevin. Third-party risk management has really been certainly a hot topic, both from a financial services company perspective as well as, frankly, from a regulatory perspective over the past several years. In part, this is due to most of the regulatory bodies releasing updated guidance and/or bulletins on the topic as it relates to their oversight and, frankly, increasing expectations as it relates to third-party risk management. In addition to that, certainly coming out of the financial crisis, there's been a lot of issues identified specific to third parties and how they operate as it relates to products or services that have been offered through those third parties via financial services companies, specifically banks. So as a result of that, you've seen a lot of fines and a lot of regulatory consent orders and other actions taken in the industry related to products and services that have been supported by third parties through these banking institutions. And as a result, there's been certainly a lot of focus on how do we ensure that these issues don't continue to persist in the industry, and in addition to that, how do we manage the risk not only more efficiently but more effectively across the board.
And Brian, I would expect that part of the result of these developments has been a growth in vendor management functions in financial services organizations. What are the different vendor management roles across a bank?
One of the things that has continued to persist in the industry has been the fact that within the banking industry in particular, but frankly for all financial services companies, you have a mix of not only different types of models that have been implemented to manage third-party risk, but also varying degrees of involvement from a variety of different stakeholders. Typically speaking, there is always a first line of defense vendor manager type role whose primary role is the point of contact between the institution itself and the third party, and usually that involves primary ownership of that relationship, as well as some risk mitigation or risk management requirements as well as part of that job description. In addition to that, you might have a variety of, frankly, other first line and more importantly second line roles, including a procurement or sourcing team, information security and IT, compliance, privacy, AML in some cases, as well as, frankly, legal as being part of that process. All of those stakeholders have, in one way, shape, or form, some type of involvement in this process. And as a result of that, there's been a varying degree of success and, frankly, failures in the industry in trying to bring all of those stakeholders together and managing the third-party risk in a more efficient manner. And as part of that, certainly with the changes that we've seen in the industry, most organizations today are still trying to figure out what the best way to do this is for their organization.
Thanks, Brian. That's a great segue into our next question, which is for both of you. But Chris, let's bring you into the conversation and have you start first. What have been some of the vendor manager failure points over the past few years in financial services companies?
Yeah, Kevin, there's been a number of failure points and challenges that we've seen across banks and financial institutions. The first, I would say, is not spending enough time or attention beyond the initial risk assessment process, and specifically the activities related to ongoing monitoring of vendors and third parties. A lot of time and attention was applied early on in developing a policy, developing a framework, developing the inventory of vendors and third parties that companies are doing business with. But in many cases, they tail off into the actual monitoring activity. So that's probably a key failure point that we've seen. Related to that, within that first line of defense, which is the front line within the business that Brian just touched on, that front line ultimately owns the risk and the responsibility for managing the third parties. But in many cases, you see organizations that have blind spots. They don't have the visibility across the enterprise. They don't have a complete aggregated picture of the risks or issues that are being brought with these third parties. They may not fully understand the extent they're engaging with third parties when you look across the organization outside of their individual departments. The monitoring function, really has been seen as kind of an added job function outside of their day-to-day roles. Many cases don't have the time to do the activities needed, don't always have the skill sets needed to perform them effectively. And then finally, I would say lack of attention to training and change management. So this is not something where you can roll out a policy and expect people to apply it and adopt it overnight. It's a constant communication and messaging that needs to take place. And then the follow-up and monitoring to make sure that people are, in fact, following the processes that you've outlined.
Yeah, Chris, and again, one thing that I would add to that as well is, frankly, with the vendor manager role and how that's evolved over the past several years, you have a case where, frankly, the old job description was typically you have your day-to-day activity, and then you have on top of that some form or fashion of being a vendor manager, and that usually was much more of a point of contact person between the bank and the third party itself. And there wasn't much of a risk management role related to those activities. In today's environment, however, most of their job descriptions still include all the other stuff, but then they've been added with this expectation of having to understand all of these other risk disciplines that, frankly, one, they probably were never hired to perform those types of activities, and two, they most likely don't have the expertise or the experience to understand what they're really even being asked to do. And that includes not only from an operational risk perspective and what the third party is actually performing on behalf of the financial institution, but also looking at things like compliance, information security, privacy-related considerations, amongst, frankly, all the other risk disciplines that may or may not be applicable to that particular relationship. So, thinking about it another way, most organizations have a second line of defense, and you have all these different teams and all those different stakeholders that I mentioned earlier that have particular skill sets, and they've been trained either through some type of university degree in that type of space, or frankly just years of experience in working in that type of field. And you're taking all of those areas and expecting a vendor manager that has never been trained or had any of that experience to take on some type of responsibility for all of those risk disciplines. And it's a stretch, right? So certainly that is a key contributor to the issues that I think the industry is facing with respect to the vendor manager role itself, and expecting these individuals to be able to kind of pick up and do all these things when they've really never had that type of expertise in the past.
I think both of you have done a great job of explaining that certainly there are some areas for growth when it comes to vendor management. As we wrap up our conversation, Chris, I'll pose the last question to you. What are some best practice approaches for vendor management in these organizations, and in particular, an effective first line of defense?
Yeah, I would say it starts with really stitching together the entire third-party risk management lifecycle, not only as it impacts the first line, but all lines of defense across the organization. That lifecycle being defined as your research and development and planning activities, due diligence and third-party selection, contracting and onboarding, monitoring, and then ultimately termination. And really understanding, as Brian walked through earlier, what the roles are across the organization within each of those core activities, and making sure that, as I said earlier, that they're stitched together in a cohesive fashion. In many cases, there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of different stakeholder groups involved, not only the first line, but when you've got subject matter experts from compliance, from IT risk, from business continuity planning, that have a key role in that process, making sure that there's an effective view and understanding of what the roles are, really who's on first as the ball moves down the court in terms of the different activities, and making sure that it is tied together in a holistic fashion. That really starts with, as I mentioned earlier, having that clearly defined policy and framework, having standardized processes. That's kind of motherhood and apple pie stuff. From there's been a lot of dialogue and discussions with our clients recently around the evolution of the organization structure. And in many cases, what started as a completely decentralized organization structure, oftentimes born out of the IT organization, and then you've got pockets that typically are stood up in the different lines of business. There was a gradual migration towards more of a hybrid approach where you have a centralized function that's dictating policy, that's driving some of those processes and trying to drive some standardization, but still decentralized in terms of the performance. Now towards moving to a more centralized organization structure where you have a little bit more control over the organization, you can make sure that compliance is there and centrally led. Going with that, having an overarching governing and governance authority to make sure that, again, beyond just those that are transacting the process, but you've got that governance in place. And in one particular case, making sure that you've got a single point of contact for the enterprise vendors or the critical third parties, whatever you call them. As I mentioned earlier, the blind spots that we often see are those organizations that are doing work across a bank, and the bank may not have complete visibility as to all those different relationships, those different contracts, and so making sure that you've got that roll-up or single point of contact. I mentioned previously a little bit about the change management and training, and I can't stress that piece enough. From a best practice perspective, it's more than just a one-time roll-up. There has to be a continuous focus on awareness and adoption, followed up with ongoing audits to make sure that you've got that adoption and that process compliance. And then finally, while technology is not the silver bullet, certainly helps to tie a lot of these things together. I mentioned the framework previously, utilizing automation and workflow within a technology solution to tie the organization, to tie the processes and the business rules together is a key point when you look at best practices. Providing visibility, again, the workflow that I mentioned, and ultimately giving the access to the necessary information, risk, performance, and the documents that are needed to go through the vetting, the due diligence, and that monitoring of these third parties is a key piece. So kind of looking at those points, I would say those are some of the primary best practices.
Chris and Brian, I want to thank you very much for joining me today to discuss vendor management challenges and roles and areas for improvement within financial services organizations. I want to point our audience to a number of materials on Protiviti.com that might interest them. We have 2 white papers that relate closely to this subject. One called Vendor Management, Realizing Opportunities in the Financial Services Sector, and the other, Enabling Speed of Innovation Through Effective Third-Party Risk Management. And finally, there's a recording of a recent Protiviti webinar on the intersection of fintechs and vendor risk management. Again, all of these are available at Protiviti.com.